Should we start at the beginning, do you reckon, Peggy?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So you applied to be an intern, didn't you, for the job?
I did. And I feel like one of the luckiest women in the world to have the opportunity of a lifetime to serve Ronald Reagan as his executive assistant, and really in many ways to have a front row seat to history. And it did start when I was a college student, and I took a chance and wrote a letter to the office of Ronald Reagan. I was kind of that political nerd that always loved politics and government and presidents. And Ronald Reagan had just left office and returned to Los Angeles, which is where I was in college, and took a chance and wrote a letter to the office, never expecting to even hear from them, and was surprised and thrilled when I got an interview at the office of Ronald Reagan and was hired pretty much on the spot to start working for what I thought would just be a short-term internship as I was graduating from college. And at the end of my internship, I graduated, and the woman who had hired me actually returned to Washington, D.C., and they asked me to take her job. So I found myself as the executive assistant to the chief of staff in the office of Ronald Reagan. I was a new college graduate. I was also running the internship program, which I had recently been part of. And so that was an incredible opportunity as well to be able to bring in hundreds of young people over the course of the next decade to also have their front row seat experience with President Reagan. But I went from that role, serving as the executive assistant to the chief of staff, to working for the president himself. His executive assistant he had had since before he was governor retired, and they asked me to take that role. So you don't say no to a job opportunity like that, although I was 6 months pregnant at the time and wasn't quite sure how I was going to navigate professional life and personal life. But President and Mrs. Reagan were terrific. They were warm and welcoming and so supportive. And I actually got married and had 3 of my 4 children while I was serving as the president's assistant. So I was very grateful to them. I feel like in a lot of ways, my kids grew up with President and Mrs. Reagan. And in a lot of ways, I think I did too. I started for him in my 20s and worked for him until I was in my 30s, and stayed connected with him until his passing, and really until Mrs. Reagan's passing as well in 2016, just a few years ago.
So did you feel like you were out of your depth, and how did you cope with it?
Well, I think the beautiful part of this role is that whether you work for the president of a country or the president of a company, there's so much of the role that is exactly the same. And we all, for the most part, start at the bottom and have to find our way up that ladder, whatever that ladder looks like. And so for me, I stepped into a role that I knew was far too big for me. And so I wanted to, of course, do my job with excellence, but I also wanted to figure out how the little part that I was playing fit into the bigger picture. And so as much as I did my job, I was very big ears and was listening to the people around me and how did they talk to people? How did they get the things done that we needed to get done? How did they interact with people in a way that was both strong and diplomatic, and really learned to, I guess, adopt or copy or mimic that language. And so learning to fit into my environment and then bring my own specific traits and skills to the job was what I tried to do. I was very fortunate to work for somebody like Ronald Reagan, who was the type of leader who really believed in the people around him. And I would say he gave me his trust and loyalty, maybe even before I earned it. And as a young person, that's very empowering because I felt like he did trust me. And so rather than motivating me by this sense of fear, like I was going to mess up or something, I really had this deep sense of commitment. I wanted to get it right. I didn't want to miss anything. I knew that for every 100 people that called the office, 99 of them probably got me instead of him, much to their chagrin. They wanted him, but instead they got me. And so what did they think of him by their interaction with me? And that applies to everybody, because for most people in this role, you are the face and the voice of the company. And most people will never talk to or see or meet the big boss, but they'll interact with you a lot. And so what do they think about your company, your brand, your boss, based on their interactions with you? And so I would constantly think, if Ronald Reagan himself could have picked up the phone and talked to this person, how would he have spoken to them? How would he have made them feel? And I know he wouldn't have rushed them or act like they were an annoyance or an interruption to the day, but they were the very reason why his day even existed. And so that was always the mindset I tried to bring with it, just remembering that I was the face and voice of him for so many people who would never have a chance to meet him. And so a bit of pressure, yes, but also a wonderful opportunity to interact with people in a way that I knew he would have had he been able to himself.
So he kind of gave you the rope to hang yourself, if you like.
Of course, the expectations were high, and I felt them every day. I mean, you don't want to draft a letter for the former president of the United States with a typo in it and have him sign it and send it out, nor would you want to misstep in a way that, especially for somebody who, like that, we're dealing with Secret Service, we're dealing with actual physical threats on his person. You don't want to do anything that would ever jeopardize him. And so always thinking not only about the moment, but 5 or 10 steps ahead, and what are the repercussions of saying this or not saying this, or advocating in this space or not speaking up when I see something of concern. And so trying to balance that nice tightrope of being assertive without being aggressive, being firm without being bossy or bullying, but always keeping in mind whatever was best for him. I was willing then, even as a very young person, very young and green, I was willing to put my neck out and step into something from a position of strength and authority if I knew it would be important to him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because he'd been shot once already.
Yeah.
Once is one time too many, but he'd been shot.
Yes.
And there'd been an attempt on him already. So
Yeah.
and that doesn't stop when somebody finishes their term of office, does
Right.
it? No.
Right.
So
Especially with somebody like Ronald Reagan. You know, we see a lot of former presidents and they leave office and they could walk into a room and people would say, oh, there's President whoever. And there wouldn't be this rush. And with Ronald Reagan, anytime you stepped into public, there was this pressing and this rush and this intensity to want to meet him and shake his hand. He just had this charismatic personality that was magnetic and drew people to him. And as much as he loved that, it was also something to be very cautious about. And that was Secret Service's role. But we had to work very closely with them and interface with them on a daily basis to ensure that his movements were things that would be safe for him, but still accomplish the things that he wanted to do in a day.
looking at previous interviews that you've had, you said you didn't see yourself as a gatekeeper. You saw yourself as a gateway.
So this concept of a gatekeeper is, you know, you picture somebody sitting behind the desk and every answer is automatically no. And the goal is to keep everything out, basically, you know, almost like a tennis player trying to hit 100 tennis balls flying at you at the same time. And that becomes impossible. And that also becomes very frantic. And then it becomes almost a game. So, oh, if Peggy's away from her desk, maybe we can stick something under the president's nose for him to sign or get him to agree to something. Or when she's gone, maybe we can sneak around her. And I never wanted the game to go around me. I wanted people to know that the fastest, the most efficient, and the best way to get things done was through me, not around me. And so I saw myself as a gateway, not a gatekeeper, and a gateway to the president. And so things that needed to get done only by him, things that rose to a level of requiring his attention or his signature, then those came to me and then went through me and right back to people. Things that came to my desk that didn't rise to the level of needing his attention, or maybe didn't need his attention right then, of course, were rerouted. So rather than picturing myself kind of at the end of a street, I almost pictured myself in the middle of a roundabout. And so people would come to my desk with things, and a lot of times, of course, I would reroute them on, but I tried never to have just a hard no. It was, well, somebody else is already working on that, or that's something we're going to be talking about next week, so come back to me next week with that. And to have it be a very open dialogue, I didn't want people to avoid me. I wanted people to come to me, because one of the greatest assets of a good executive assistant is to kind of be the keeper of all knowledge, because we actually know more than the boss, because we see all the things that the boss doesn't see. And so it's very important not to be that gatekeeper in the sense that you keep people out and they're afraid to approach you, but really a gateway, that you're a conduit toward getting things done, not an obstacle from getting things done.
I mean, I can remember years and years ago, you know, when I I was in Fleet Street, and my boss at the time, he had this EA or secretary, she was called at the time, but it was the same thing, and she had the same responsibilities, and she was respected as any EA today, and this is back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I would see people, and it just talking about your gateway thing, I would see people who wanted to influence the boss by saying, dropping a few comments to her that they thought he might pass on to him at the time. And she was quite clever, and she was quite savvy, and she worked out when that was going on. But and I guess it would have been the same for you. But you'd come fresh from college or university. How did you learn about that kind of stuff? Because you've got to be a little bit switched on, haven't you, to make sure that doesn't happen, and not get cynical, and stay as a gateway and not a gatekeeper. So how did you have any not instances of that, but how did you kind of deal with that, or when did you recognize that sort of thing was you could be abused in that way, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, I certainly did get my fair share of, flowers and cookies and nice phone calls and things like that, people trying to influence the boss. But I guess in general, I just tried to always focus on the fact that it was not about me at all. It was not about me. I had the opportunity to serve this man, but it was all about him. He had spent an entire lifetime creating his brand, his persona, doing all the hard work and the heavy lifting. I considered myself to be so fortunate to be there, but it was never about me. And so I think when you keep that in mind, then it doesn't matter. And people can say what they want, good, bad, or otherwise. They can try what they want to bribe or cajole you into having a certain point of view. But if you constantly have the mindset of what is best for my boss, what would he do if he heard this? What would he think if he had to make this decision? And just really get yourself into the head of the boss instead of thinking about it from your point of view, then I think it changes everything. I never thought it was about me. It was always about him. And so as long as you keep that at the forefront, then the criticism doesn't bother you. All the bribes don't bother you. And I use that word loosely, of course. But you realize that those people are fleeting. When I stopped working for the president, you realize the phone doesn't ring with all the same people who wanted your time and attention before. So just remembering that it's always about him and always about how can I use my time to best serve him, period.
Did you get any training from anybody? Did you ever anyone to say, hey, Peggy, don't do it like this, do it like this? Or
I wish I had training. I wish there were magazines and support groups and forums and conferences that I could go to. And maybe back in the day there were, but I never heard of any, and I never was part of any groups like that. That would have been very helpful. I would say I learned from the people around me in the office who were tremendous individuals. They were all talented and highly skilled at what they did. They were very diplomatic. And at the end of the day, as much as it's nice to have support, you need to find your own way, and you need to find your own rhythm of what works best for you and the boss. And especially if you work for the top boss, in a way, it's very isolating. And a lot of times you feel like you're on an island, even within your group of other admins or EAs, because ultimately the buck stops with the boss, and everybody knows that you have access to the top person, and that you probably know more than anybody else. And they also know that you're the eyes and ears of the boss for the company, or in some instances, an organization. And a lot of times people aren't so willing to share freely in front of you or talk about things in front of you. And so a lot of times I did feel like I was a little bit on an island to myself. And that's okay once you realize that, but certainly ask for help when you need it. But ultimately realize that, especially if you're working for the top person, it is in a lot of ways an isolating role.
Yeah, it's going to get a bit lonely, isn't it, I guess?
It does, just because you realize that people see you as having access to the boss, and they don't know what you're going to say or share with the boss. And so I think that they sometimes guard their actions and their words around you, which is fine, but then also makes you feel like you're part of the group, but maybe not all the way in.
So just going off on a little tangent here, how do if you've got someone working in an organization, every once in a while we all have like a bad hair day or whatever it might be, and you chuck your toys out the pram and have a little sulk and stomp and then come back and it's all okay. But how do you do that when you're the EA to the big cheese, the boss? How does that work?
Yeah. You don't. You don't have a bad day. You cannot allow yourself to have that moment, at least publicly. There may have been plenty of days I got into my car and maybe cried my eyes out or used a few curse words as I was driving away. But again, it's not about me. It's not about how I feel. It's not about how my feelings got hurt or about how I'm frustrated that somebody scolded me publicly. It's all about the boss. And can I take that criticism to heart? Can I hear the essence of what they were talking about? Can I find a way to prevent that from ever happening again? And really be a little more thick-skinned about things. I think a lot of people are looking to be insulted or hurt or handheld a little bit by the boss. I actually think that if the boss is willing to give you constructive criticism, it means they see you as somebody that they can trust, that they see as somebody who is hardy and willing to and able to withstand criticism, and they trust you, because that's what trusting relationships do, is they have open dialogue and they're willing to say things that sometimes are hurtful in the moment but help you move forward in a more positive and stronger footing. And so especially if you're working for the top boss, you can't have even a bad hair day, because you never know who's coming to the office.
I sometimes, if it was really bad, I'd get in my car and drive and I'd shout at the top of my voice because it's quiet. But then I stopped that after a while because you'd see people looking, what the hell's going on there?
I know. And we are human, and I don't mean to diminish the fact that we're human, we have emotions, we have feelings, but I think in general, if we're not looking to be insulted and to be hurt, and if we're looking to be treated as an equal and somebody who has a strong position of standing in the office, then we also need to be willing to be emotionally strong as well. And, one of the things I love to talk about is obviously the mechanics of the job are very important. You have to have the skills to do your job, whether it is the technology or the technical skills or the capacity to manage multiple tasks and to do them with efficiency and with excellence. That has to be there. So the technical aspect, the mechanics of your job, you have to have those and you have to get them right. But then you also have to have a mindset that allows you to grow and to be respected in your role. And that mindset is a leadership mindset. And regardless of where you are on the organizational chart, you need to look at yourself as a leader, because you are. And other people are seeing you as a leader. They're seeing that you speak with the authority of your boss. And so adopting that leadership mindset allows you to approach your job with a greater confidence, with a greater willingness to work with people, to accept criticism, to press through hard moments, because that's what leaders do. And so rather than seeing yourself as somebody who's kind of a potted plant waiting to be told what to do, I would come to the office every day with a game plan, and I knew exactly what the president needed to accomplish that day. I had in my mind pretty much an outset of an agenda of what his day was going to look like. Of course, we were willing to adapt that as was needed, but I really had an offense, not just a defense. I didn't just sit back and wait for him to provide instruction. I had an offense and a game plan for every single day that could be adapted, but that comes when you have a leadership mindset rather than that of just sitting back waiting to be told what to do.
Were there ever times where you felt, oh, crikey, I'm not happy with whatever it might be, and you sit down with him and said, look, I've got to speak with you about this, and about perhaps your and his direct relationship. Did you ever have those kind of difficult things and or those difficult conversations with him, and how did you approach them? How did that work? Did you ever have that situation?
Yeah, definitely. And in my book, I write quite extensively about sort of that transition period when he announced to the world that he had Alzheimer's disease, and the world starts kind of saying goodbye to him. But I'm still saying good morning to him every day for the next 5 years. And so navigating that completely unknown space between here's a man who's basically been told he will diminish in his mental capacity until he dies, and yet is choosing to come to the office and to live life as fully and as best as he can. And I'm going to be there with him to help him navigate it, but completely unsure about what that's going to look like and what that's going to feel like and what that's going to be like for him and for me and for our working relationship. But I guess it changed from then this feeling of he was the boss and whatever he says goes, to acting, I guess, maybe just from a more standpoint of a loving relationship. And, what would be the most loving thing to do for a man that is very elderly, that I'm very fond of personally, yet I serve in a very professional capacity. But finding a way to navigate that space of ultimately being very professional always, but also with a little more softness, I guess, to our relationship than we had before, to help him navigate those very uncertain and very frightening years ahead. And especially as a young person, that was very daunting to think about signing myself up for something that I didn't know how that was going to play out, but I knew he didn't know how it was going to play out either. And so the trust that had to come with the two of us basically saying, okay, we don't know what this is going to look like, but I'm here and I'm committed to you, and whatever it looks like, we're in it together. And that was frightening, but there was no place else on earth I would have rather been than there. And I know a lot of people work in a capacity for somebody that maybe it's an instantaneous car accident or a heart attack, or maybe it's a cancer diagnosis or something like that. And so all of a sudden, this professional relationship becomes very personal. And so how do you navigate that while still maintaining that professionalism, but surround that relationship also with an air of compassion and of humanity, I guess.
People want to keep their, I mean, we all want to keep our dignity, don't we? And so you must have had some quite difficult conversations, because it was all uncharted territory, as you say.
Was, especially back in the day, because back in the 90s, nobody even knew what Alzheimer's was. They thought dementia, senility, it's just old age, it's kind of forgetful. Nobody really knew what it was. And I really think that we have Ronald Reagan to thank that today there is so much information about Alzheimer's, and we know so much about it, and we're working toward a cure, thankfully. So families don't have to suffer. But it was a disease that had such a shame and a stigma attached to it. I admired the fact that he and Mrs. Reagan were willing to take something that was very private and painful and go public with it. And they did wind up helping so many people. But you can imagine sitting at that desk every day, and so interacting with him with a sense of optimism and a smile on my face, even though my phone is ringing all day long with people crying, and I'm opening letters of people saying goodbye to him and sending heart-wrenching letters and memos to him. And, so trying to navigate the professionalism of that while still trying to absorb the emotional impact of losing somebody I really cared about.
And I guess you've also got to find a way of questioning their judgment, and I mean that in the best possible way, because when you have something like Alzheimer's or dementia, you're not always in a position to make the right call, are you? So you have to do that as well.
And so again, having a relationship of trust, for me to kind of have a game plan for the day, and obviously with somebody with Alzheimer's, that game plan sometimes has to adjust, but to have already been in a role where I felt comfortable asserting myself into the schedule and the tempo and the timeline of the day, I think that that was important so that whatever came, he knew that even if there was a moment when he wasn't quite sure what was happening, he would look to me and he'd know that I knew.
Oh,
And so it was kind of that reassurance of, I've got you, Mr. President. We're okay. We're all good. You're good. I'm good. We're all good. Yeah. And just that reassurance. And that does come with a trust relationship that is established over time. And I'm so grateful that he gave me the opportunity to serve him from a position of trust, and it really played well, especially in those later years that were very difficult.
what a great story. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. Peggy, I want to change the subject a bit before I start crying.
Don't read the book then. You'll get to the end and the world says goodbye to him, and
Yeah.
after we're done with the formalities of the world saying goodbye to him, that's when I finally for the first time allow myself to feel the gravity of losing him, because yes, he was a world figure, but he was my boss and somebody I was so personally connected to and had been through so much with him those last 10 years and had become so close to Mrs. Reagan in particular, and to watch her pain and her heartache, and to be part of that, it was I wouldn't have chosen to be anyplace else, but it was a very difficult, very
Yeah.
emotional time after the fact, especially.
Nancy Reagan, Mrs. Reagan.
Yeah.
I am a well for information, not a fountain for it.
Yeah, I had a great relationship with Mrs. Reagan, and I'm so appreciative of her because, of course, here comes this young woman who is serving her husband in the office, and she could have had a very adversarial relationship with me, but instead chose to have just a beautiful, loving, helpful, kind, informative relationship with her. She was somebody that I felt like I could ask protocol questions to, and I think she appreciated the fact that I did ask. I learned very early on with her that there were a couple of things that mattered to her. Loyalty was tremendously important to her. She knew that I was fiercely loyal to her husband and to her, and that was important to her. And she cared about the truth, and she wanted me to always tell her the truth, even when that was a difficult conversation to have or something I didn't really want to tell her. I would call her and say, Mrs. Reagan, I need to tell you something, and then lay it out. And I learned early on, don't try to fix it, solve it, sugarcoat it, just tell her because she wants the truth.
Yeah.
And so I did very well with her because she knew I was loyal and would always tell her the truth. And one of my favorite little things that you're alluding to is when I would call her sometimes, and she did like kind of the inside scoop sometimes. And so before there was the internet, or before we would, get all the good stories online, I would hear things through my little grapevine or my network of people. And so sometimes I would call her and say, Mrs. Reagan, do you have a minute? And she'd say, yes. And I'd say, all right, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody where you heard it. And she'd always say, Peggy, I am a well for information, not a fountain. And I loved that. I thought it was such a perfect way. But then I also sort of adopted that as my own motto, I guess, in my role, that I became a well for information, not a fountain. And sometimes the temptation, especially when you work for the big boss, if you are the source of all knowledge, there's great temptation to be a fountain
Yeah.
and to tell all and to dish a little dirt and to
Yeah.
spread a little gossip. But in the long term, that never serves you well. And to breach confidence is never worth it, even if it's done in jest, even if it's done just seemingly in an innocent way, and even sometimes if it's done amongst coworkers in the office. One of the challenges I had when I was asked to write my book was, how do you take a position of proximity like that, something that's so personal, and share that story in a way that doesn't cross any lines? And And so at first I wasn't even sure if it was appropriate to write a book. But then I was actually speaking at a conference a couple of years ago and was approached by a guy who said, he runs a presidential history project. And he said, "Oh, Peggy, you have to tell your story in book form." And I kind of pushed back on him and gave him the usual, "Well, I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think I would ever do that." But he said something to me that completely changed my mind. He said, "If there was a woman who sat outside Abraham Lincoln's office door or George Washington's office door every day for 10 years, don't you think we would want to know what she learned, what she saw, what she observed, and
Yeah.
don't you think she would owe it to history to tell us?"
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
kind of changed my mind. I still wasn't sure I was going to write a book, but through just a crazy set of circumstances, a few years later, a book opportunity landed in my lap, and I felt like it was the time and the format to do it. And I was grateful to my publisher who pushed me to tell a story that was revealing, but ultimately allowed me to tell one that was respectful as well. And so I love the fact that I've written a book that I feel like reveals him in a way that people haven't necessarily seen him before, but I can still be very proud of my role and my service to him and don't feel like I've crossed any lines of confidence.
No. How do you manage to navigate your way in the world by making, and you're very forthright about what you say.
Right.
How do you manage to do that without really hacking people off or people pointing the finger and saying, "Yeah, Peggy Grande, she's a whatever it might be"? How do you
Yeah.
do? How do you do it? I want to know.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, that was a very nerve-wracking place to be. And actually, when I was approached about writing my book, one of the most terrifying thoughts was, I've written for President Reagan and spoken on behalf of him for so long. I don't know how to write for myself or speak for myself, or what do I really think? And am I comfortable advocating for my own point of view? And so I kind of had to come to terms with that first and decide that everything I learned from him had informed my life. And I was so grateful for that. And that was the foundation on which the rest of my life could be built. But I didn't have to speak for Ronald Reagan every day moving forward, although certainly his influence lives on in everything I do. And so with World for Brexit in particular, and with any of the other things that I've done in the political arena, my goal always is, can I speak with civility? Can I listen to people with whom I disagree? Can I advocate for my point of view from a position of strength and clarity, but do it in a way that is polite and civil? You know, it used to be that we could disagree without being disagreeable. These days, it seems like in the political arena, if we disagree on something politically, then that means that I have to hate you personally, and I have to try to ruin you personally and ruin your family as well. And that's just not the way that I do life or do politics. And so regardless of what is thrown at me, my goal always is, you may not disagree, you may not agree with me, you may think I'm misguided, but can I reply from a sense that is gracious, that is civil, that takes your point of view into account, while not giving ground on what I believe? And the things I believe are very much in line of everything that President Reagan spoke out for. I would never put words into his mouth and say he would say XYZ on this issue, but I know in general that he was an advocate for freedom. He was an advocate for democracy, the Brexit issue in particular, whether or not you thought that that issue should have gone to a national referendum, whether or not you were on one side or the other of the vote. What it came down to for me was that was an egregious breach of democracy. The people had been asked to vote on something. They had turned out overwhelmingly in the largest vote in British history and had voted for something that the people had said they wanted to leave, and Parliament basically said, well, we want to remain. And so for 3.5 years, this was a stalemate. If we had seen the vote and the free will of the people ignored anywhere else in the world, whether it be Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, there would have been this global outrage. You know, why did we not listen to the fair and free vote of the people? And yet, in one of the longest standing democracies in the world, we saw democracy basically put on hold. And so as we watched that play out, I think everybody thought the vote happened in 2016. It was done and dusted, or set and sorted, as they say. But as we saw extension after extension, and there was an increasing appetite on the will of the people to leave, and a decreasing appetite on the will of the parliament to actually implement that, that was when we got together with a group of people and said, I think we need to be an outside voice, shining a spotlight on this breach of democracy and advocating for democracy, whether or not you believed in the cause at the beginning, which, regardless of which side you were on during the vote. Democracy is something that we should all be watchdogs for and be very vigilant for, because if democracy can be threatened there, it can be threatened here in the US, it can be threatened there in Australia and worldwide. And so that was kind of what got me into that issue. And then also to remind the UK that once they left the EU, there was a world of trading partners just waiting for them, whether it's Australia or the US, the Commonwealth nations in particular, that we're all just waiting for them to have free will to be able to create their own bilateral trade agreements.
But you don't pull punches, though. I mean, I've heard your commentary on TV, and I've read your comments. You don't sugarcoat it. And no. I mean, I know you don't attack people. I know you attack the argument, and that's something that everybody says. But yeah. I still find it very interesting. For some reason, you haven't, they, whoever they might be, your opposition, haven't tried to cancel you, you know, and you know, or negate your.
I'm advocating for that. You know, I'd like to think I learned from the best, and I guess as a young person, I maybe thought naively that you had to choose. Am I going to be strong and successful, or am I going to be a kind, good person? And I guess, especially as a young person, I didn't think those two could coexist. And then I met Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan personally is the nicest, most charming, fun-loving, joke-telling, storytelling man that you would ever meet. You would just want to sit by the fire and have story time with Ronald Reagan. But also housed in that same person was a man who was infinitely strong and who was so committed to his principles that he was willing to go toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union, to stand at the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate and challenge General Secretary Gorbachev to tear down the wall. I mean, yeah. That takes incredible strength and fortitude and backbone. And by the way, he did it against the advice of his advisors, his own speechwriters. They had taken it out of his speech so many times. The State Department said, don't do it. It'll cause World War III. But he was a man of conviction and principle and got mad on purpose and was willing to take a tough stand on principle, not for him, but for the people he knew that he was advocating for that didn't have a voice.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So those were the types of things that empowered him. When he felt like he was bringing voice to the voiceless, he looked at the fall of the Soviet Union and a lot of the end of communism, so many places in Eastern Europe, and he never gave himself credit, but he said, once people get a taste of freedom, they can't help but want more. And so he saw himself as maybe the spark plug or the catalyst to that. But really, it was the people that he empowered to do the hard work, to want freedom and to stand up against their governments. And so he was not somebody to pick a fight, but he certainly was willing to stand his ground when he was convicted he was right. And even, you know, the Soviet Union, when people were criticizing communism and they said, oh, I think it's just a giant misunderstanding. He said, it's not a giant misunderstanding. It is the very essence of good versus evil. And so he was bold, and I think that his being convicted, being tied to principle, he modeled this capacity to be strong and unapologetic for what you stand for and still couch it in this beautiful, kind humanity that at the heart of everything is the people that you're advocating for.
And I guess some of that rubbed off on his EA.
Maybe so, maybe so.
Okay, Peggy, I mean, I could do another hour, but I think we've got more than enough here. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate that.